This presentation is one that I did as a keynote at the CAR Symposium, and its focus is on methodology actually. And so I felt that it might be a useful framing of research for this field. It certainly resonates with my field. So it focuses on the diverse methods of noticing, understanding, and acting, which yeah, relates to the range of research methodologies that are available, or that's necessary and required. So in thinking around methodologies for researching complex phenomenon, which we know out-of-field teaching is, I've been researching in this area for quite some time now, since probably 2009. And what I have found is that it is a very complex phenomenon, and I've chosen to focus on certain things, but I also know there's parts of it that I haven't focused on. But it was interesting thinking about how my research has changed over time. And specifically, I thought about, how does the phenomenon of out-of-field get noticed? How is it understood? And how is it attended to or responded to, both with it nationally, by government organisations, etc., but also by me as a researcher, and also others who I've noticed their careers change and develop over time as well. So thinking around why this type of reflection is important, there are multiple groups involved in out-of-field. There's multiple relationships between different stakeholders, and different methods used in order to understand some of those relationships and experiences. Therefore, different theoretical lenses are needed, and also there's multiple impacts that we can notice depending on our theoretical frame. So thinking around noticing, understanding, and acting begs the questions of who notices what, why do they notice, how do they notice, and who do they tell? And then thinking around who understands, how are they understanding, and for what purposes are they seeking to understand? And then thinking around who's acting, who's prompting that acting, what is the outcome, and how do we know, and how do they know the effects of those outcomes? So research into out-of-field teaching, I've found, can tend to follow this trajectory of somebody noticing the phenomenon, then taking steps to understand its effects for different stakeholders, and then there's this process of evaluating or calling for certain actions. And I've seen that occurring at a national level as well as an individual researcher level. So I won't spend too much time on this, but of course, out-of-field teaching, it is as a context for research. The assumption is, I think, that out-of-field teaching is part of this idea of teaching being a learning profession. Also, what's clear is that out-of-field teaching is a global and systematic issue that directly affects the quality and equity and sustainability of education. So therefore, it's a worthwhile area of research. In terms of thinking around how to look at this noticing, understanding, and acting, I used sense-making theory that provides a framework for looking at the dynamic interplay between those three things. It focuses on the process through which individuals and groups interpret and make sense of complex phenomena. It's relevant in educational research for looking at how teachers and students navigate and make their way through this complex environment. And its particular feature is based on the fact that it looks at the disruptive ambiguities, or it disrupts ambiguities. In other words, it makes it clear for the researcher. It begins in it focuses on that noticing and bracketing. It's mixture of retrospective remove people. It's a mixture of retrospect and prospect. Its reliance on presumptions to guide action. And particularly, I found it useful because when you apply it to systems, you get an understanding of the various players involved. So it looks at how systems behave in response to out-of-field teaching, so shifting the focus necessarily from the individual teacher to the actual system is what I like about this idea. Researchers can gain access into the dynamic processes through which these systems notice, understand, and act in response to the complex and evolving situations. So this idea of shifting from the individual to the systems is particularly what I like through this lens. In terms of noticing, to begin with, I've noticed that researchers, governments, and subject associations or teacher unions, they might notice the phenomenon first through capturing data, for example, on the prevalence of out-of-field teaching and inhibiting effects. Leading then to a demand for accountability. So who's accountable? And some examples of this that I've seen are where they research focusing on teacher qualifications, the incidences and links to student achievement. Of course, in the US, we've got Jim, who's here today, who's been doing some amazing work there. The early work by Ingersoll, Darling Hammond, and then also the Goldbahir and Dee and Cohodes work as well, working with large data sets and making commentary around that. In Israel, we've got Denista Smids and Zuzovsky's work that we're looking at prevalence and impacts. And of course, in Ireland, their work there, early work by Moira and colleagues there, also we're looking at the incidents which had prompted the PDMT being implemented there. So let's look at how then systems notice, understand, and act. You've got your systematic data, parliamentary inquiries, media might raise some attention to it. You've got pressure from key stakeholders and surveys maybe that understand the scale of the prevalence. So that's how they might first notice it, and it might also come out of, for example, large-scale student achievement, PISA or TIMSS, that shows problems with student achievement, and then they start looking into why. Then you've got the notions of understanding, which might come out of commissioned research. There might be some collaboration with researchers. There might be some systematic data collection. So that's happened in Australia when they've noticed they've done some data collection, and then there might be some inquiries also particularly focused on education generally. Then acting might look like funding provided for professional development or programs for respecialization. There might be partnerships for design and delivery. And then there might be some workforce initiatives in response. So they're the types of things that I'm talking about when I talk about noticing, understanding, and acting. In terms of my own research, 2012, I published a paper that was looking at a range of papers that were looking at the incidences. Certainly when you see the high incidence of out of field, you're sort of thinking what's going on, and that does beg the question. And it seeks understanding. An important bit of research that came out of Australia was Weldon's work. National survey highlighted the high levels of out of field, and that prompted a lot of action. And that's moved into a new Australian teacher workforce data set that's been developed since then as a way of monitoring the situation. So that's been an interesting progression to see that change over time. And then some examples of state governments understanding some commissioned work that has been done. So I did some commissioned work for the Victorian government, and then there was also some similar work done in New South Wales. And then understanding moves to action. So they some in Victoria, for example, there's been some graduate certificates that have been funded by the government specifically focused on out of field teaching. So there's a bit of a progression there, and it's exciting to see this occurring. Whether it stays that way is another thing. Often these things are a product of an individual within the government who thinks it might be a good idea to do this work. So just very quickly then, because I know that I've got not a lot of time left, but I just wanted to give you some snapshots of a few projects that I've done which map out, I guess, me noticing, understanding, and acting, usually not just on my own, but with others. So some methodological diversity that I've had across my research. Case study enables a close look at what's happening. So interviews, and I'll show you the TASB project and some of those metaphor work that I've done. Longitudinal studies, I've done a couple of those looking at change over time when it became clear that it's often research is a static snapshot, but I wanted to capture the change over time for teachers. The cross-sector study enables us to look at the different parts of the ecosystem to see how they interact and what value there is in collaborating around that. Literature reviews obviously are critical to understanding how the field is moving. And I think having periodic literature reviews to see how it's both expanding as well as changing and what the predominant ideas are is a really valuable methodology for us as researchers to keep abreast of understanding the phenomenon and to see how the actions are changing globally. And then practice-based research, once you start moving into that action, particularly around how governments are acting, and part of that evaluation is an important part of that. And those three projects there that I've done, we've been involved in evaluation. The first one I was involved in implementation as well. Theoretical lenses are focused on different, allow you to focus on the phenomenon in different ways. And it's interesting when you think about your own theoretical frames, what you've brought to your research and how that's changed the way you see the phenomenon. I really like looking through out of field through different lenses. My predominant one, of course, is the boundary crossing that basically frames everything I do. And identity theory is important when you're looking at teachers. You can see the range there, and I'm moving now into that ecological systems theory, and well, I could put this sense-making theory in there as well, given that I'm using that now. But I just wanted to show you a few, three different projects. So the first study I did, this was actually the first study, but this came out of my PhD, not as a study, but as an idea. So I noticed in my PhD, the out-of-field phenomenon became clear, apparent to me then, and this was my follow-up project to begin to understand what's involved here for teachers. So it was a case study approach, teachers in rural and remote schools, and I started using the boundary crossing lens at that point. And from this basically led to my 2013 paper, which a lot of people are aware of. But that actually has framed pretty much most of the way I think about out of field. And there were a number of papers that came out at that time. Also my 2014 chapter, which focused on the notion of field. It helped me to understand what that meant in that context. So it was me moving from noticing to understanding a bit. So I started to understand some of the dynamics involved for teachers. And then I moved into our first Australian Research Council funded project. Actually, no, I've had a few other projects, which I won't mention in between these, but this one enabled me to work with some others on this. None of who are here today, but I'll show you some of the things. But basically, this was case study again, but also a bit of a look at teacher practice and school context as well. And so it broadened the phenomenon for me. The idea of metaphor was used, and also uh, this was one of the methodologies we used to collect data, and this was useful to highlight the experience of learning to teach out of field, also mapping people's change over time through the fortune line. So it's a 3-year project, so a little bit longitudinal. And this particular methodology provides a way of mapping experience over time against certain criteria. And here we focused on capacity and enjoyment. And that led to some interesting analyses and papers. Being a broad team, there were a lot of papers that came out of this. But this is an example of one of the metaphors, and you can see the fortune line that was developed there. The idea of out of field, learning to teach out of field is like a like being a deflated football. So not useful for your intended use. So it's not about the feeling of being deflated, but I liked here about the usefulness of us as teachers. And also some other work that came out of that, or analyses focused on the beliefs, and some work that Vale and Colleen and Coral did relating to that was really interesting work. So that broadened it up to the notion of beliefs and focusing on the nature of the subject. And since then, I've collaborated with various people, including Susan, to look at the nature of subjects. So understanding how different subjects, what experiences of that looks like. And then the next one is, oh yeah, we also use chat, cultural historical activity theory, to analyze some of that data as well, to look at the individual experiences. Okay, the third study then is the one that I've got at the moment, and we've got a few people with the Scope T background, and Susan as well is part of that. Greg, Emily, oh, I can't see who else is here. Sorry, there may be others involved there. So this one to me is a commitment to action, because this one's looking at how the relationship between out of field and professional development. So to my mind, action-oriented research draws on understandings, but also uses methodologies that are designed to critique, influence, and change policy. So that's our commitment to action. So according to this, then research with action-oriented collaboration works across sectors. And it therefore critiques how the current pathways are valued, challenged, and privileged. And it enables us to interrogate the cultural norms that need to shift. And there's this process of imagineering connections between what we know now as our pathways for more pathways towards becoming in-field, and thinking around what's actually required to for teachers to become in-field when they're out of field. And so that's the broad ideas that we're looking at, thinking around, do we need a more integrated system, for example? So we're using a range of methodologies here, and I'm not sure if I think I've introduced this previously in this context, but at the moment, I'm going to show you something that's come out of just the first part, which is the grey bit on the left, which is the literature and policy review. Of course, we've moved into the green part, which is the interview study, and analysing and presenting on that. But this basically study uses the ecological systems theory in order to understand at that system level. So moving away from the individual teacher, although that is part of it, but looking at the various parts of the system and how they interact, and also how they change over time. And then this has what's come out of the first phase. And you can see the different, I'm not going to go into this obviously, but there's 6 different categories of factors that we noticed within the literature. So within research literature, policy documents, subject association documents, professional development. And you can see on the outside how that's linked into the systems. So then reflecting on that journey of noticing, understanding, and acting, it's useful to think about the different methodologies that can be used to understand the phenomenon. And this came out of some earlier work that Raffaella and I did, which is in our second book in that last chapter, I believe. But looking at what research can do through these different sort of tools. So they can be looking at the types of out of field, different typologies, looking at the degree of effects and impacts. Thanks, Susan. And then also looking at what judgments of fit, how we can describe the experience, the effects of the interventions, the types of tools that can be used to act, and the important part of critiquing policy and also policies and practices, but also critiquing those actions is a responsibility of us as researchers. So future directions for research, I think, is the notion of is thinking about what tools and the creation of tools. Longitudinal studies, I think, are going to be very important to be able to look at change over time. Very large scale data sets, lucky for those who already have them, but working towards having more of those available. Delineation of subject differences. The effects of being out of field is very different depending on what subject you're in. And then global studies, I think, and Raffaella and I have a proposal about that. So then I'll go back to those three questions and I'm going to end here. So thinking for yourself, but also as a field, who notices what and what do they notice and why are they noticing that and how are they noticing it? And then that important of who they tell. Who do we tell our research to? Who understands? How do they understand? And for what purposes? Why is it so important to understand this phenomenon? Again, also, who do we have to tell about that? And then who's acting? Is it us acting, or are we also going to be prompting action by others? And what sort of outcomes do we want from that? And then how do we know the effects of those outcomes? So ultimately, this process of sense making for me, a question then is what sense is being made by our research and what light is being shone on the cracks and on what's coming up when we go through that process. So that's it for me. Thank you very much, and I welcome your questions or comments.